The recent talks in Riyadh between US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov marks the most extensive high-level engagement between Moscow and Washington in the last 3 years. These discussions, which lasted close to 5 hours, signal a shift in the dynamics of the Ukraine conflict and, more importantly, even the broader European security architecture. In its first formal in-person meeting between Russia and American officials since the war in Ukraine began, both sides have indicated a willingness to engage in a serious process to end the Ukraine war. Some of the key achievements and breakthroughs of the Riyadh negotiations include both the United States and Russia agreeing to form high-level working groups to begin discussions, hoping to negotiate an end to the Ukraine conflict. According to the Russian President Vladimir Putin's top aide, Yuri Ushakov, who was also part of the negotiations, said that both sides have agreed to take into account each other's interests and advance normalized bilateral ties. There was also widespread speculation about a possible meeting between both the principals, that's Presidents Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, before the end of the month. Conditions for a potential meeting between the two leaders was also discussed, although no date has been set. Lavrov also said that the American side now has a better understanding of Russia's position, particularly regarding NATO expansionism, which was the primary reason for Putin to launch the war in Ukraine 3 years ago. Trump's national security advisor Mike Waltz, who was also present at the talks, indicated that the issues related to territory and security guarantees both were part of the discussions. These initial steps suggest a potential pathway towards de-escalation and eventually a negotiated settlement, although significant challenges and uncertainties are still there along the road. The talks in Riyadh represent a crucial first step, but whether or not they will lead to the resolution of this conflict still remains very uncertain. Several factors will determine the success of future negotiations. While American officials have said that there is no intention to exclude Ukraine or any of its European partners from future peace negotiations, the fact that they were not present in the room in Riyadh and were not included in these initial discussions has raised some concerns across Europe and certainly in Kyiv. European experts have warned that Washington has begun negotiations with Russia over the heads of Ukraine and other Europeans, and that these talks eventually may extend beyond ending the war. It could include the very future of the European security architecture. The willingness of both sides to make concessions will be critical. Any peace deal currently would involve Ukraine giving up about 1/5 of its territory from since this war began. However, it remains to be seen whether Ukraine will be willing to cede any territory at all or compromise on its aspirations to join NATO. Trump seems to be playing on the fact that Ukraine and Zelensky have no choice but to surrender. Lavrov has also emphasized that any NATO troop deployment to Ukraine, even if it is going to be under any other flag, would be unacceptable to Moscow. That issue remains another major point of contention, and that could also potentially derail the negotiations. So let's game out the future scenarios. How could the Ukraine war likely play out over the next 3 or 4 months? Several scenarios could unfold in the coming months, depending on the progress of negotiations and depending on the actions of the key stakeholders. Scenario 1, there is a negotiated settlement and an end to the hostilities between Russia and Ukraine. Now, in this scenario, both the US and Russia continue to engage in constructive dialogue. Ukraine and its European partners will eventually join the negotiations. A ceasefire is agreed upon, and discussions begin on a long-term political settlement. This could involve some amount of territorial concessions from Ukraine, security guarantees for Ukraine, potentially short of any full membership to NATO. That's completely off the table. It could also pave the way for lifting of sanctions against Russia, and ultimately, this is the big one, this could pave the way for holding elections in Ukraine. Trump, in fact, has been insisting that Zelensky is not all that popular since this war began. He's also been egging on the Ukrainian people to go for elections soon.
I love Ukraine, but Zelensky has done a terrible job. His country is shattered, and millions of people have unnecessarily died. And you can't bring a war to an end if you don't talk to both sides. You got to talk. They haven't been talking for 3 years.
The message from Washington, the message from Trump directly seems to be very clear. If Zelensky stands in the way of a peace deal, then Zelensky can be dispensed with. That's the first scenario. The second scenario is that the Ukrainians continue to fight on, egged on by its European partners. That would lead to a frozen conflict. If these negotiations between the United States and Russia stall or they fail to produce a breakthrough, the conflict could then devolve into a frozen conflict, just like the Korean War. Neither side is able to achieve a decisive victory. This would involve continued fighting along the front lines. There would be no end in sight for the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, and there would be heightened tensions between America and its European partners. If Ukraine decides to carry on fighting, then Europe will have to step up to fill the void that's been left behind by America's withdrawal. And then there is scenario 3, which is less likely, but it's possible. That is an escalation in the war on the front lines. In a worst-case scenario, the conflict could escalate, potentially drawing in other countries, and this could occur if the negotiations collapse and the fighting intensifies. Russia expands its military objectives beyond the Donbas region, which is in the eastern part of Ukraine, and that, if it were to happen, would leave NATO with no choice but to become more directly involved in the conflict. It will eventually drag in America as well, even though Trump is quite reluctant and quite keen to end this conflict. Trump has specifically spoken about the Ukrainian people looking beyond Zelensky. It raises the possibility that the US may be considering a change in leadership in Ukraine. It remains uncertain, though, whether America will remove Zelensky if he stands in the way of a peace deal, but General Keith Kellogg, who is the points person, the envoy appointed to end this war, his proposals stipulate that the United States will cease all military aid to Ukraine if it does not agree to holding peace negotiations with Russia. Under the Martial Law Act that was passed by Ukraine right after Russia launched its invasion, presidential, parliamentary, and local elections have been suspended. Elections can only be held after martial law is lifted. And to lift martial law, it has to be by presidential decree, for which Zelensky has to agree. Experts say that elections are a realistic scenario if only there is a ceasefire and if martial law is cancelled, but not before a ceasefire, not before the lifting of martial law, which is why Zelensky's role becomes important. Whether Ukraine will accept the terms of a new deal, that remains a significant question. Zelensky has said that Ukraine will never compromise on the country's territorial integrity. However, Ukraine may be pressured by Washington to make concessions to Russia. Other clauses that may be more palatable for Kyiv include a delay, not an outright rejection of NATO membership, freezing the current front lines as they exist, holding elections if there is a ceasefire and if martial law is cancelled, exchanging Ukraine's foothold in Kursk. Remember, this is a part of Russian territory which the Ukrainians now control, at least some amount of it, in a surprise operation that happened in August of last year. They could potentially use Kursk as a bargaining chip in return for Russia giving up some of occupied Ukraine. Ultimately, the decision will rest with the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people, and they will need to weigh the potential benefits of a peace agreement with Russia against the cost of continued conflict.